Meine Damen und Herren, ich bin sehr froh, hier zu sein. Danke für diese Gelegenheit. Now I'm going to switch to English. I am an Israeli Holocaust historian who also researches Nazi Germany, and I am a third-generation Holocaust survivor. When I was at a conference in Berlin at the Topography of Terror, I happened to see the Heydrich exhibition and wrote an article about it for an Israeli magazine. You can search for Daniela Ozacky Stern and Heydrich, and you'll find the article in English. Today, we are going to talk about two people. One is Reinhard Heydrich, born here in Halle, who became one of the leading Nazis responsible for the murder of millions. The other is Shlomo Ahronson, an Israeli historian who dedicated years of his life to researching Heydrich and the machinery that made him possible. During his studies, Ahronson interviewed key figures who knew Heydrich, including traveling to East Germany, to Halle and other places, and interviewing his relatives. But Ahronson's research took him beyond archives and interviews. In 1964, he sat in the living room of Heydrich's widow and listened to her describe a mass murderer as a gentleman. This uncomfortable encounter forces us to ask, when evil is done in the world, how do we assign responsibility? Shlomo Ahronson, born in Tel Aviv in 1936, was a scholar of Nazi Germany who led a remarkable double life as both journalist and historian. He was a news editor in Israeli radio, helped found Israeli television, and served as a foreign correspondent. What brought Ahronson to study the Nazi apparatus was a moment that defined his generation. In 1960, as a student at the Hebrew University and a journalist, he heard about the capture of Adolf Eichmann in Argentina. For Ahronson's generation, Eichmann was the incarnation of evil. Together with his academic advisor, Shaul Esch, Ahronson wrote a brief biography of Eichmann. Ahronson attended the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in 1961, as did Hannah Arendt, whose concept of the banality of evil would later resonate with his own research. Watching the trial, Ahronson realized that to truly understand the problems of continuity and change in German values under the Nazis, he would have to go to Germany. Indeed, in 1962, he became one of the first Israeli students to study at the Institute für Zeitgeschichte in Munich under Helmut Krausnick. Ahronson wanted to write about the beginning of the Nazi security services. Krausnick believed that Heydrich, the Gestapo, and the SS had been largely explored. Ahronson disagreed. He began searching through archives and undertaking what he called many difficult interviews with former SS and SD leaders, former Gestapo members, and bureaucrats. Over the years, his scholarly work focused on several major areas: the Israeli-Arab conflict, nuclear weapons in the Middle East, and most relevant for us today, the history of the Gestapo and the SS. His doctoral dissertation examined Reinhard Heydrich and the early history of the Gestapo and the SD, the Nazi Security Service. He spent years on this research, traveling to archives across Germany and conducting dozens of interviews with people who had lived through the Third Reich. One of his most difficult challenges was getting to Halle, Heydrich's birthplace, which lay behind the Iron Curtain in East Germany. The East German government did not recognize Israel and saw it as an American ally. Getting a visa was nearly impossible. Ahronson tells in his memories that he went to Checkpoint Charlie in a snowstorm and made his way to the offices of the National Front, a non-governmental body handling foreign relations, headed by Professor Albert Norden. The building turned out to be Goebbels' former Ministry of Propaganda. At the entrance, guards in uniform demanded his passport. He reached into his pocket and it was empty. The passport had vanished. He searched everywhere and found nothing. The guard stared at him severely beneath a portrait of Lenin. Finally, he remembered a hidden inner pocket in his coat, and there the passport was. He was then sent to see an official at the Institute for Criminal Affairs at the Academy of Science. When Ahronson explained that he wanted to travel to Halle to interview Heydrich's family and examine the city archives, the official refused. Halle was a border city with a Soviet garrison. Foreigners were forbidden to go there. But the official, called Janke, added that he himself was traveling there soon and could interview Heydrich's sister Maria Heindorf and her husband Wilfried on Ahronson's behalf. Ahronson should prepare a questionnaire. Weeks later, a telegram arrived. Departing for Halle, bring questionnaire to my office. Janke, People's Police Headquarters, Alexanderplatz. When Ahronson arrived at his office, Janke was in uniform with a pistol. Ahronson asked him how Heydrich's family would react to an armed officer entering their home. Janke became angry. You have pity for Heydrich's sister? Ahronson replied. He was a murderer, not her. Janke mocked him. You with your Jewish sense of justice. Ahronson turned, walked out of the office and slammed the door behind him. Going down the stairs, he asked himself, now what? Then he noticed a door marked Foreigners Police. He knew that they also issued visas. He went in and explained that he was an Israeli student researching the history of the Gestapo and Heydrich's alleged Jewish origins. This was something he was interested about, and that he needed to travel to Halle. The officer stared at him and said, I don't know what you're talking about. You just told me you want to attend the annual trade fair in Leipzig. We encourage foreign visitors to our Leipzig fair, but all the hotels there are full, so you'll have to stay in nearby Halle. He signed the visa. The next day, Ahronson set out. That, he wrote, was how we discovered the holes in the yellow cheese of the regime. After visiting Heydrich's family in Halle, Ahronson concluded, they were not Jews, though there may have been a drop of Polish blood in their veins. Ahronson was determined to understand evil from the inside. He later published a monograph on Heydrich, and in what became perhaps his most celebrated work, a comprehensive study titled Hitler, the Allies, and the Jews. Ahronson died in February 2020 at the age of 83, leaving behind a body of work that had done much to bring the history of the Nazi apparatus of terror to both scholarly and general audience. It was a doctoral research, the years of digging into Heydrich's life, that brought Ahronson, as a young journalist and emerging scholar, to a remarkable and unsettling encounter, a visit to the inn ran by Lena Heydrich, widow of the man he had come to call Satan himself. Before we can understand the strangeness of that meeting, we need to understand who Reinhard Heydrich was. Because the story of how a young naval officer from a musical family in Halle became the chief architect of the Holocaust is not simply a story of a monster. It is a story about ambition, opportunism, careerism, and institutional loyalty. Reinhard Tristan Heydrich was born in Halle in 1904. His father, Bruno, was a composer and the director of the local conservatory. His mother's father had been the director of the Royal Conservatory in Dresden. The family was cultured, musical, middle class. Heydrich grew up playing the violin. In the 1920s, Heydrich joined the German Navy. He was talented and ambitious, dreaming of becoming an admiral. He was tall, athletic, physically impressive. His naval career ended in disgrace in 1931 when a Navy Court of Honor found that he had been engaged to two women simultaneously, one of whom was Lina von Osten, his future wife, and that he had behaved dishonorably toward the other, the daughter of a senior naval officer. He was dismissed from the service. It was a humiliation. He went home to Halle, cried like a child, and even threatened to commit suicide. In the weeks that followed, he considered taking over the management of his father's conservatory. His father had just suffered a stroke, and the institution was in danger of closing. For a brief moment, the future architect of the Holocaust was contemplating a life as a music administrator in the same city we are in today. This is a crucial moment. Heydrich was 26 years old, unemployed, in the middle of the Great Depression, with his professional identity, the only life he had ever imagined for himself, stripped away. What happened next tells us a great deal about how the Third Reich created its most dangerous servants. It was Lina von Osten who pushed him. She had connections to the Nazi movement and she urged Heydrich to join the SS. His mother, too, a forceful and ambitious woman, recognized that the Nazis were rising and wrote to a family friend who was an SS commander. That connection led to an introduction to Heinrich Himmler. When Heydrich met Himmler, he claimed to have been a naval intelligence officer, which was a lie. Himmler, impressed by Heydrich's Aryan appearance and military bearing, gave him a test. Heydrich, who had learned what he knew about espionage from detective stories, performed brilliantly. He was appointed head of the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst, and was given a black uniform with a death head symbol. The rest is history. Heydrich and Himmler built the machinery of Nazi terror together. The Gestapo, the SD, and eventually the vast network of the Nazi camps. Heydrich was its operational genius. He understood surveillance, intimidation, and the psychology of fear. His rise was meteoric. By age 27, he had set up the SD. By 30, he was head of the Gestapo. He was also in charge of the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units that followed the Wehrmacht into the occupied territory. In January 1942, Heydrich chaired the Wannsee Conference outside Berlin, where he announced that he had been appointed to implement the final solution, the systematic murder of 11 million Jews across Europe. In September 1941, Heydrich had been appointed Reich Protector of Bohemia and Moravia, occupied Czechoslovakia. It was the Czechs' darkest period. He was driving each day from his country estate to Prague Castle along a fixed route. In May 1942, Czechoslovakian paratroopers ambushed his Mercedes at a bend outside Prague and tried to assassinate him. He was hit and a week later died. He was 38 years old. The reprisals were horrific. The Nazis destroyed 2 entire villages, including Lidice, shooting all the men, sending the women to camps, and kidnapping children for forced adoption by German families. Additionally, the mass extermination of Polish Jewry was named Operation Reinhard in his honor. With that history in mind, imagine being the young Israeli journalist and emerging scholar Shlomo Ahronson stepping through the door of a small hotel on the Baltic Sea in May 1964. Lena Heydrich had converted the family's former holiday home into a guest house. The sign outside, which Ahronson noticed and found surreal, advertised, "Stay at the Heydrich Inn, vacation, fresh air, sea." Ahronson wrote about the visit in a long article for an Israeli newspaper. He describes arriving at the door, finding himself greeted by a young blonde woman whose face he instantly recognized. The same small, narrow eyes, the same long, sharp nose, the same thin lips. It was Heydrich's daughter. Even her voice, he noted, was thin like her father's, in contradiction to his imposing physical appearance. He was shown into a reception room heavy with dark German furniture. On the sun terrace, a blonde, blue-eyed toddler played. He was Heydrich's grandson. Then Lena Heydrich herself entered. She was 50 at the time, a widow of over 20 years. Post-war newspapers had described her as a monster who personally instigated the reprisal massacre at Lidice and ran her inn as a neo-Nazi gathering place. In person, Ahronson writes, she did not look like the devil. She picked up the smiling toddler and settled in to talk. What followed was hours of conversation. Lena told him about her life. She was eager to speak and enjoyed the memories. The first time Hitler gave a speech in northern Germany, I was a schoolgirl. Anyone who wasn't there cannot understand. What he said, I no longer remember. What I remember is how he said it. The power, the passion, the emotion, he drove the listeners and led them after him. She described meeting Reinhard at a naval party in January 1931. A real naval lieutenant, nearly 2 meters tall, magnificent in his uniform, a true gentleman. She described how he had danced with her and told her he was from Halle, from a family of musicians. She fell in love with him. She remembered him playing string quarters with 3 friends, Johann Sebastian Bach, mostly, and weeping in moments of musical transcendence. This is one of those details that resists easy interpretation. The man who would later organize the murder of millions wept over Bach. And then she described his humiliation when he was discharged from the Navy. Her account established that Heydrich was not initially ideologically driven. He was a career man looking for uniforms after the only career he had ever wanted was taken from him. When she pushed him toward the SS, he was not motivated by hatred of Jews. He was motivated by wounded pride and the desperate need to restore his professional identity. My husband, unlike Himmler, was not a theorist. He did not dream racial dreams. Himmler theorized everything. My husband was not interested in skull measurements or Aryan tribal history. He simply wanted a great, strong Germany. Germany was for him a geographical concept, not a racial one. He wanted to succeed in his new job at any cost. Ahronson describes the discomfort he felt in this afternoon. He acknowledged that some of his readers might think he had lost his mind, sitting in this house, accepting this hospitality, listening to this woman speak of her husband as though he were a misunderstood professional. At one point, he confronted her directly. She had been arrogant about how her husband, as head of the criminal police, had brought crime rates down to 0. Robberies, rapes, murders. Murders, Ahronson said, but your husband was the greatest murderer in history. Lena looked at him with impatience. If that's what you mean, well, those were orders. He didn't initiate them. Ahronson went for a walk along the shore to clear his head. Her final words on the subject of the Holocaust were, "You have to understand, he was a soldier. He once said that if Hitler had ordered him to dance with a corpse, he would have done it willingly. He died at the right time," she said, at the height of the Reich's success. Ahronson's reflection at the end of this scene is important in his writing on Heydrich. Looking at the flowers in the garden, listening to the sound of the sea, he asked himself, is this the banality of evil? Not in the figure of a monster, but hiding here in the flower beds and in Heydrich's tears when he played Bach? The question he posed in that garden on the Baltic coast is one that historians are still debating today. Ahronson's doctoral thesis on Heydrich contained a controversial argument. He believed that Heydrich, widely regarded as the true brain of the SS and the Gestapo, the satanic inspiration behind Himmler's plans, was, in reality, principally Himmler's instrument, not a man of exceptional independent initiative. This was not an attempt to minimize Heydrich's crimes. It was a scholarly argument about the structure of the Nazi apparatus and the relationship between its two most powerful figures. The argument bears directly on the question that haunts Germany to this day. How do we assign responsibility for the Nazi past? If Heydrich was merely executing Himmler's will, did that shift responsibility upward? And if Himmler was merely executing Hitler's will, did the responsibility collapse entirely onto one man? Or does responsibility multiply, spreading through everyone who chose to obey rather than to refuse? This is a living political question in Germany. Responsibility is not collective guilt imposed from outside. It is a willingness to examine honestly how a civilized nation produced the machinery of genocide and to recognize that it was produced not by monsters, but by careerists, opportunists, and ordinary people making bad choices. Lena Heydrich's narrative, for all its self-serving quality, actually supports this more disturbing understanding of responsibility. She describes Heydrich not as a fanatical ideologue, but a careerist, a man who joined the SS because he needed a job and a uniform, who was transformed by the institutional culture he helped create. He did not arrive as a genocidal murderer. He became one through choices. It means understanding that Heydrich's path from unemployed naval officer to architect of genocide illuminates not his uniqueness, but the terrifying human capacity that exists everywhere. Ahronson was a historian who refused to let serious historical questions be distorted into political weapons. His message was that the question of responsibility must be pursued with maximum rigor and minimum ideology, and that evading the question, whether through collective guilt or through collective amnesia, serves no one. And to recognize that such choices remain possible, that ordinary people can be ridiculized into killers through ideology, resentment, and institutional support, is precisely what makes Halle 2019 so chilling. On October 9th, 2019, Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, a 27-year-old German man, Stefan Balit, drove a rented car to a synagogue in the city of Halle, the same Halle where Heydrich was born. He was armed with homemade firearms and explosives, carrying a camera, streaming everything live. Balit posted a manifesto online targeting Jews especially, and it chose Yom Kippur to maximize casualties. There were about 50 people praying in a synagogue. When he failed to penetrate the building, he killed two people outside, Jana Lange and Kevin Schwartz. He denied the Holocaust and blamed Jews for all the world's problems. In December 2020, after the largest criminal trial in the history of the state of Saxony-Anhalt, Balit was sentenced to life imprisonment with almost certainly never to be released. He expressed no remorse throughout the proceedings. His only regret, he said, was that he had killed white people rather than Jews or Muslims. Halle, the birthplace of Reinhard Heydrich. The site of an anti-Semitic attack on Yom Kippur 2019. The hatred wears new clothes. The machinery is the same. To conclude, in 1964, Ahronson sat in that Baltic garden listening to a grandmother describe a mass murderer, as a gentleman who wept over Bach. He was discomforted. In asking, is this the banality of evil, he showed what serious historical scholarship demands, the willingness to sit with difficulty rather than reach for monsters. His argument that Heydrich was less a demonic force than a careerist, absorbed and ridiculized by an institution, does not make him not guilty of his crimes. It actually implicates everyone, the ideology, the party, the state, and every individual who chose compliance over conscience. Heydrich, in Lina's telling, was just following orders. Balit, in his own telling, was doing what others had failed to do. The self-justification is almost identical across 80 years. This is why the study of the Holocaust exhibitions like Reinhard, Heydrich, Career, und Gewalt remains not only an act of memory, but an act of living responsibility. Thank you, vielen Dank für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit.